Let's face it, politics is a pretty interesting game and has been for quite a while now. Shifting sands indeed, looking at the political landscape. I never really thought I would ever say this, but it does look as though if there were a general election called tomorrow, Nigel Farage is on course to become the next Prime Minister. Now, I'm somebody who started working with Nigel back in 2007. Almost 20 years of my life. And while I always hoped through those endeavours that we might see a massive revolution in politics, you never really think it's going to happen. You think the first past the post system is so entrenched and the sort of legacy two-party politics is so much of our heritage that getting any sort of breakthrough that could change things is for the birds. Well, looking at these polls at the moment, this was courtesy of YouGov. You've got Reform UK on 271 seats. Projected seats. The Labour Party on 178, the Lib Dems on 81, the Conservatives on 46. And that's not a bad outing for the Conservatives at 46, because I've seen some polls projecting seats, putting them on, well, 10. But there you would have, essentially, a pretty healthy Reform UK majority. Is it going to stay that way? Is this a protest vote? What is all of this based on? Is it policies? Is it the want for radical change? Can the Conservatives claw it back? Can the Labour Party have a resurgence? Or might this now be a trend that's become so baked in, we can predict that is what it will be come 2029? Well, let's speak to someone who might have answers to those questions in the form of Joe Twyman, who is the founder of Delta Poll. Good morning to you, Joe.
Good morning, Alex.
Now, I've heard a lot of people in the legacy party say, well, you know, it's just reform, it's a protest vote, nothing to see here. When it comes to the crunch, Nigel Farage isn't serious, people will go back to voting how they always have. And I'm there going, I'm not sure. This seems like an established pattern, and it might be a protest vote, but I think it's rooted in policies that I don't think at any point over the next 4 years are going to be addressed by the Labour Party. I don't think they're going to be able to massively reduce inward migration, particularly illegal migration. I don't think they are going to be able to combat the cost of living. I think, if anything, it's going to get worse. And so I wonder whether the needle will actually move by 2029. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a long time to go until the next election. I think that's the most important thing to say. As pollsters, we ask if there were a general election tomorrow, but we know there's not a general election tomorrow. And even in the situation at the moment, the Reform UK would be on for 271 seats, and that is well short of the 326 that you need for a majority. So it's not a majority as things stand at the moment. But over those 4 years, things could change for any of the parties. And if anything has taught, if we've been taught anything from the last 15 years of British politics, is that nothing can be ruled out. But I do think it's early days. During the 1980s, for instance, during the early 1980s, the SDP were on more than 50%, 50% in the polls at one point, and by 1983 they had completely collapsed. The challenge for new parties is still there. Now, you could argue, quite rightly, that Reform UK are not a new party in the same sense the SDP were. But that doesn't mean they still don't face the same issues that a new party does when it comes to actually performing on the ground. And one thing that MRP surveys, such as the one that produced the figures you quoted, one of the things they can't do is take account of hyper-local factors. So there's still a lot to play. But having said all of that, the first year of this Parliament has been characterised by a rise in reform. They have led in all of the polls for May and June now, and so they are definitely the success story of this Parliament, while Labour have fallen back. But will the long-term trends continue? As I say, we just don't know.
In terms of popularity, today, of course, is the first birthday of the Labour government. I don't know if they're going to be lighting candles, gorging themselves on cake and popping the Prosecco just yet, because it seems to me their popularity ratings are pretty dismal compared to previous Prime Ministers after 1 year in power. How is Starmer looking?
He's historically one of the lowest performing prime ministers that we have ever had, which is clearly bad news. Compared to Tony Blair, for instance, he's doing extraordinarily badly. But the situation that Tony Blair inherited from the Conservatives in 1997 is completely different from the situation, particularly regarding the economy, that Keir Starmer inherited from the Conservatives in 2024. So it is a very different situation. But having said that, no Prime Minister of any party wants to be in the kind of poll ratings that we're seeing for Keir Starmer at the moment. Only around a quarter of people say that he's doing a good job. while around about 2/3 say he's doing badly. So that's not a great position to be in. Having said all of that, none of the party leaders are doing particularly well at the moment. Nigel Farage tends to poll best, but he also has the largest proportion of people saying they don't like him. So it's a complicated public opinion picture across the political spectrum at the moment.
Picking up what you said about people who are opposed to Nigel Farage as a sort of Marmite character, could a successful move by the left wing be to all get together and do a sort of vote for us to keep reform out? Do they have the firepower, if they conjoined as a force, to do that? That's what we've seen in other nations where legacy parties have tried to crowd out the populist vote, which is essentially creating coalitions, trying to block that from happening. Do you think that could be a manoeuvre that the left-wing parties could take? Have they got enough amongst their number, if they could coordinate, to do that?
Well, I think some sort of formal arrangement is very, very unlikely, at least before a general election result itself. If that general election result produced a minority, as the poll suggested it would if one were to occur today, then perhaps we would see something more official. But going into an election, what I imagine we'll see is that in certain constituencies, one of the anti-reform parties, and I would include the Conservatives in that, might take their foot off the gas a bit in particular constituencies if they know that there will be a quid pro quo in other constituencies more favourable to their party. But this is all speculation. It's certainly the case that Reform are doing well at the moment, and the parties will look to respond to that. But I think certainly the Labour government, before it thinks about any kind of coalition, informal or formal, with other parties, what it will want to do is improve its own position in the polls. And at the heart of that will be an improvement to the economic circumstances in this country. That will be what Labour will be concentrating on over the next 4 years.
We've seen in recent times the launch of lots of new mini parties. It seems that bored businessmen don't go and play golf anymore. They set up political entities, and disgruntled Labour politicians, rather than just sitting on the back benches and taking Pilates lessons, also want to make new parties. How much of an impact could new smaller entities have on a forthcoming election?
Well, you can ask people in the abstract construct of a survey instrument how they would vote, how they would hypothetically vote in a hypothetical election for a hypothetical party. And you usually get around 10% of people saying they would vote for them. It doesn't matter what that party's position is or not. What you're asking them is who they would vote for. What they're actually answering is how they feel about mainstream parties and the parties that exist at the moment. And they project their own hopes onto this new party. But the reality, and I say this as the official pollster of Change UK, is that it's far more difficult than that. And new parties do tend to struggle. And indeed, we only have to look at the history of Reform and indeed the Brexit Party and indeed UKIP to see how over a number of years they really did struggle, and it's only now they're starting to have a consistent lead in the polls. Yeah, like 30, 35 years in it. That's always what I say. This idea you can set up a party and it just works from the get-go, especially under first past the post, which leads me to my final question, which is, if in a few years' time the Labour Party are looking at the landscape and saying we're not going to stay in power with the way things are at the moment, with the seat projections, might they be tempted to pull a rabbit out of a hat and change the parameters of our franchise? Might they be tempted to give votes to 16-year-olds? Might they be tempted to introduce PR in order to make sure that there is essentially a sort of, left-wing monopoly going on into the future? Would that work out for them? Or if we did change our voting system, give 16-year-olds the vote and get rid of first past the post, could that actually play into the hands of Reform? There's no evidence to suggest that it would necessarily overwhelmingly help Labour. The interesting thing about first past the post is that it holds parties back up until a certain point and then suddenly massively benefits them. We saw that with the SNP in Scotland in successive elections, and we saw it reversed in 2024. I think it's extraordinarily difficult to play out how that would affect things in a 2029 election, assuming that does take place. I think expanding the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds, that may be something that they look at. But in all cases, I think actually doing that before the next election is unlikely, I would say. But who knows? Stranger things have happened. Yeah, who knows? I mean, what sort of government would change the way that voting works to make sure they can stay in power? That never happens, Joe. Brilliant catching up with you. The brilliant Joe Twyman there, founder of Delta Poll.